Welcome to the Fast Leader Podcast, where we uncover the leadership life hacks that help you to experience breakout performance faster and rocket to success. And now, here's your host, customer and employee engagement expert and certified emotional intelligence practitioner, Jim Rimbach.
Call Center Coach develops and unites the next generation of call center leaders. Through our e-learning and community, individuals gain knowledge and skills in the 6 core competencies that is the blueprint that develops high-performing call center leaders. Successful supervisors do not just happen. So go to callcentercoach.com to learn more about enrollment and download your copy of the Supervisor Success Path ebook now. Okay, Fast Leader Legion, today I'm excited because we have somebody on the show today who's going to help, hopefully, me clarify an important point on something that I just have an issue with. Vince Molinaro grew up in an immigrant household in Hamilton, Ontario, a working class steel city outside of Toronto. His family instilled the values of hard work, humility, and doing what is right in any circumstance. Vince experienced a defining moment early in his career when he saw a respected colleague and mentor succumb to cancer that she believed was the byproduct of a stressful, toxic work environment. That was a defining moment for him. And as a result, he has made it his life's work to boldly confront mediocre and unaccountable leadership. At the age of 27, Vince also realized he was an entrepreneur at heart and launched his first consulting business focused on helping leaders be the best that they can be and step up when it matters most. While running his business, Vince completed his graduate degrees and conducting pioneering research on holistic leadership. Today, Vince is a global leadership advisor, speaker, and researcher on leadership accountability. As the founder and the CEO of Leadership Contract Inc., Dr. Molinaro travels the world helping organizations build vibrant leadership cultures with truly accountable leaders at every level. He has traveled and worked in 25 countries and 80 cities. And he and his team continue to call out the global leadership crisis today and thoughtfully lays out the strategy to address it head on. His unique combination of provocative storytelling, evidence-based principles, and grounded practicality has leaders at all levels stepping up to fulfill their organizations to drive the success of their organization. His research and writing on leadership accountability are featured in some of the world's leading business publications. He is a New York Times best-selling author and has published several books, including Accountable Leaders, The Leadership Contract, and The Leadership Contract Field Guide. He is also a co-author of 2 other books, Leadership Solutions and The Leadership Gap. He also shares his insights in his Gut Check for the Leaders blog and through the Accountable Leaders app available from Apple and Google app stores. Vince and his wife, Elizabeth, live near Toronto with 3 lovely children. Vince Molinaro, are you ready to help us get over the hump?
Yes, I am. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, Vince. Now, I've given my Legion a little bit about you, but can you share what your current passion is so that we can get to know you even better?
Well, you know, it's given the world we're in right now, the passion that I've always had on helping leaders be the best they can be is what drives me, because given the experiences I had early in my career, I learned that leaders can have a tremendous impact on the lives of their employees, which in turn influences the lives of customers that companies and organizations serve. And I've been fortunate to be led by great leaders who I really admired and found how I just intrinsically stepped up to want to please them, want to have them feel proud about my contribution and want to really drive our success. And I had the flip side. I worked with leaders who weren't as great, mediocre, sometimes downright awful. And I knew what that felt like at a very deeply personal level and the impact it had on my performance and my morale. And so to me, it's really simple. It matters more. Now it matters even more given how our world has been upended. And that's what drives me every single day.
You know, and as you're talking, there's so many things that kind of, I've taken little notes down that I want to chat about. But before we get down into that, for me, I had mentioned something that I struggle with that it's just been an issue for me for quite a while, is that concept of the word accountability and accountable. Because oftentimes when I hear that word, I have come to create this bias associated with it. And the bias for me has vivid imagery about somebody's hands being in a choke position around somebody's neck. Sometimes it's mine. sometimes it's me doing it, right? Because you talked about how it influences and impacted my own behavior. Because for me, I do get immersed in the environment I am in. And I know I've been in some of those environments where it's like, gosh, I'm one of those people now. So help us understand, what is accountability?
It's such a great, it's a great point that you make, Jim, because I think there's, a lot of confusion about what it means. And we have developed kind of this implied definition that I don't think works for us. And before I kind of give you the definition, I'll kind of give you a story that I didn't realize it at the moment, but my very first part-time job was at a men's clothing store. I got it when I was 16 at a time when the industry was very traditional, and a manager, Gary, of that store took a bet on me. He said, "You're too young. I can't see it work," but I convinced him somehow, and he gave me a shot. And what I found about his style is he led through example. And he didn't dictate what we needed to do. He just you just saw him and you wanted to rally around him. So he had a sense of personal accountability that he didn't have to demand it from us. He inspired it, right? He got promoted to our flagship store, the largest store that this company had. And in came Steve, his replacement. And one of Steve's famous sayings was, "Don't do as I do what I say." And that was so so different than how Gary led. And I found myself, even though my job hadn't changed, feeling completely different. He tried to really communicate that there was a different standard for him than there was for everyone else. He didn't need to be accountable, but he expected everyone else to do so. So you can imagine how successful he was. It didn't work. Now, I didn't realize that lesson, but as I did this work over the years, I look back and kind of go, oh my goodness, the seeds of leadership accountability were there in those early experiences. So I use the term leadership accountability because it has to start with leaders. And it has to start with a sense of personal ownership for your role, to really understand what it means to be a leader and to embrace that. It is to set the tone for others so you can inspire that in others, and you don't ask someone to do something you wouldn't be prepared to do yourself, right? And it's to have that courage and that resolve to do some of the difficult things that leaders need to do. Now, here's what I've also learned through my global travels is, for example, I've spent time in Spain and Latin America where Spanish is the primary language, and I'm in those countries, and the people sort of realized, Vince, we don't have a word for accountability in our language. But yet we have it as a problem in our organization. So how do we build it when we don't have even a way of thinking about it and describing it? For example, I spent time in Italy where they said their term, accountability for them is really about who's to blame when something screws up, right? And there's an element of that, right? There's an element of that to accountability. So for me, it just comes down to personal ownership, your ability to step up, your ability to own your role, your ability to have the courage to do the difficult things we have to do as leaders.
So you mentioned, and this is an important point, and you already brought it out, the difference between the leadership accountability from an organizational perspective and that self-leadership responsibility, and you call it a dual response.
Yeah.
So when you start talking about that dual response, you start getting into the new game. You talk about the new game and that it begins before the old one ends. What does that really mean?
Well, we've always, my teams and I have always worked with organizations that were at some kind of an inflection point. And that means there was a shift in their industry. They were launching a new strategy. They needed to come together after a major M&A event. And they really need to figure out that the kind of leadership that they had was not going to be the leadership they needed in the future. And in the book Accountable Leaders, I really was looking at the future that was coming. This was all pre-COVID, of course, but looking at the future that leaders were going to be having to lead. The one quote that really jumped out at me was, Clayton Christensen's quote around the new game begins before the old one ends. And to me, that so nicely captures the real dilemma that leaders have in a world that's being disrupted, that's being changed at a rapid pace, where your own success maybe creates a sense of complacency, and you stop seeing how things are evolving and changing and shifting and not responding quickly enough. And you can see story after story of great companies who no longer exist because they missed how the game changed. And so it really means for us as leaders to be perpetually focused on understanding the change, being on top of things, and changing before you actually need to change.
Okay, so now you bring up a really important concept. So, a lot of leaders talk about situational type of leadership, right? And that you can't do the same thing when you have moments of crisis as you would when you are not in crisis. Well, arguably, you can say we're always in crisis now. However, we have forced transformation that has occurred, and there's not going back. I mean, there is no going back. It's not going to be what normal used to be. It's now permanent. New normal. Some things may have the opportunity, if you think about it in a continuum perspective, to go back. Other things, it's not going to happen. So when I start thinking about accountability and context, and I now have a different situation, when you start, referring to that, what does that mean from a leader perspective? Because now you talk about modeling.
Yeah.
There ain't no modeling this new stuff. I mean, so what do I need to do?
Well, the first thing is really understanding how the context has changed, right? Is to really try, we're using the term new normal. I kind of like using the term new reality because I don't know what's normal yet, but we need to understand what are the new realities we're grappling with in terms of, industries that have been upended, in terms of new rules and how employees are going to work, whether it's going to be completely virtual or a combination. How do you lead in that environment? So there are new emerging realities we have to understand. So that notion of the context is what defines leadership, is something I've always believed in. Then you've got to really think about, okay, so what does this mean in terms of how the expectations of me as a leader have changed? And then am I up for it? The book that's kind of a foundation to this new book, Accountable Leaders, called The Leadership Contract, is we've signed up for something really important as leaders, but when something in your context changes dramatically, as it is now, you have to really think about it. I just had a conversation this week with a colleague in an organization where a CEO had been in place for about 3 months, started earlier in the year, and this was sort of going to be his last hurrah. Illustrious career. And then this happened. And within 3 weeks of COVID, he resigned. And his reason was, I didn't sign up for this. He realized in himself, he didn't have what it was going to take to lead through this period of time. So one could say, well, why would he do that? In many ways, he was honest. He realized what his organization was needed, and he wasn't the person. He didn't have the emotional fortitude. And I think all of us as leaders need to pause and reflect on, how has the leadership contract changed for me? What are going to be the new expectations of leadership? I think there's going to be more complexity, there's more challenge, there's more opportunity, but we can't assume everyone in a leadership role is going to be up for that.
And so when you say that, you talk about in the book that there's 5 elements being part of the emerging context for leaders. And you talk about transformative technologies, geopolitical instabilities, revolutionizing work, delivering diversity, and repurpose in corporations. So when you start talking about that, I think about this particular speech that was given by Teddy Roosevelt back in 1903. And back then, he was talking about one of the biggest issues in the U.S. being immigration. Mm-hmm. Still, 100 plus years later, dealing with the same issue. And when I think about these 5 elements, I'm like, well, heck, you could arguably say that those issues were being dealt with by leaders 100 years ago. So how has the context really changed, Vince?
Well, I think those broad categories have always existed. I think what's in those categories is what's changed. So if you think about, it's fascinating, all the conversation, and these are not 5 distinct categories. They really do intermingle, right? Transformative technologies is leading, to the reinvention of work, right? Which is causing employees to think about, well, what's the purpose of a corporation? Even as COVID broke out, the first thing I did is think about, how does this global pandemic play out against these 5 categories? And I kind of go, well, luckily we've got this kind of technology that's allowing us even to be able to do remote work. the transformative technologies now that have been in place are now being accelerated. Look at healthcare. Virtual visits now are becoming more of a commonplace. Well, we always had the technology to do it. Why didn't we implement it sooner? There's a lot of talk about that, but sometimes you need a crisis to move you quicker. Geopolitical instability. I mean, COVID is a completely geopolitical issue with what's been happening in China and other parts of Europe, and countries that are helping each other out or not helping each other out. And even within countries, how you have things very regionalized. You know, the whole what work is being redefined as we speak. COVID is impacting the inequities that exist in our society around those who are less fortunate will suffer, unfortunately, greater than those who are of privilege. And we're asking ourselves, what's the purpose of a corporation, and how can corporations be a big part of the solution moving forward? So you're absolutely right. Those 5 broad categories have always been the big things leaders have had to deal with in their context. I think what's changed is what it means now and how they're all kind of coming together at the same time at this pivotal moment. And we've got to be aware of it as leaders. Sometimes, and I write about in the book, is, and there's even research that reflects it, too many leaders are just kind of with blinders on, heads down, just focusing on execution and not being aware of some of these broader issues that they're dealing with within their industries, within their countries, within the places they do business.
Yeah, well, you asked, I think, talking about that geopolitical and universal type of issue and focus, a question that you hear all the time is, so why do we not have better leaders?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons, right? A couple of reasons. The first is that context keeps shifting and it keeps raising the expectations, right? So that's one. One is about context. The second is that how we've really approached putting people in leadership roles has been a very consistent story. And it's really about, we've had this history of putting great technical performers into leadership roles. And I've heard this over and over again in all my conversations and all my speeches, where I ask people around the world, so tell me how you first got into a managerial or leadership role. And the first answer is, well, if I'm going to be honest, I got in by accident. My manager came to me one day and said, hey, I got this job. I need you to do it. Go ahead. And there's no development, no support, and you kind of figure it out on your own. And now all of a sudden you're responsible for a team. You've spent your whole career driving your success individually, being measured on your individual performance. Now you're being measured on team performance. How does that work? Not sure how to do it, so you figure it out. Some are able to succeed, some struggle, and some don't succeed at all. The other one is the people that we pick were the best salesperson, the best engineer, the best analyst, the best teacher. It doesn't matter what the area of technical expertise is. When you excel in your performance, we go to those people and say, you're so good at this job, now we're going to give you this job that's completely different. And by the way, it involves managing people, and we're going to pay you more, and we're going to give you the cooler titles. And so you feel enticed, obviously, and you want to make your boss happy, and you say yes to those roles without really appreciating what it is. And that's not to say there aren't people motivated to be leaders. That's great, but the story is pretty consistent, right? That's sort of the game plan, that happens time and time again. And then the third part is how we've gone about developing leaders has been really, really traditional. And it's, I remember working with a client once. It was the first conversation, and the senior executive said, we need a core leadership program, that's I call it the car wash model, where he just had this vision of just putting leaders through this program like a car wash. That at the end they would all come out, shiny and new and impeccably clean. These brand new leaders. Well, it's a little bit naive that is how we do it, but yet that's how it's done even to today. I think we've gotten more sophisticated, but now the challenge we're going to have is, how do you develop leaders in a virtual world? How do you develop them as they're dealing with increased pressure and scrutiny? And those are questions we still got to figure out.
You bring up, as you were talking, I'm like, oh my gosh, that storyline is played out at all levels too. Because you see, even at the frontline level. So when at Call Center Coach, we have a a virtual leadership academy that's a blended learning program where there's, defined pathways of development. There's micro courses, there's live interactive courses, there's a community, and it's broad based because everybody does learn differently. But one of the things that I do find that's quite interesting is oftentimes, and the studies show this, and you mentioned it yourself, is that somebody is put into a leadership role then, and if they do receive any type of development whatsoever, on average, it comes 3 to 4 years after they were placed in the role.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Well, and what's fascinating is when we've got in, we have programs for frontline leaders that really give them the core skills they need to be successful as a frontline leader. Well, often the people making the decisions for those programs are the senior executives, right? So we're in there, in a sales meeting or a conversation, and I can't tell you how many times the senior executives kind of, sheepishly kind of say, is there any way I can get this program? Because I never got these skills. And there they are as senior executives, really smart people leading massive companies without those basic skills of giving feedback, coaching, really listening to people. And you kind of go, well, why isn't leadership stronger than it needs to be? Well, that's kind of what we've inherited. You're absolutely right.
That's too funny, because when I first started the academy, it was all about emerging and that frontline leader. And I started having people enroll that had these senior level titles. I'm like, what's going on?
Right.
I did not target you people. Right. I did not even consider that. And then so I started asking questions, and I got 3 responses. One is, well, I was never on the front line. I don't even know what these people are really, supposed to be doing. Another is, well, it's been a long time since I've been on the front line, and I need to refresh and uplift my skills.
Yeah.
And then the other one is, well, if I'm expecting, these folks to go through this and to learn and develop, then I need to know what that's all about so that I can inspect their performance. So I got answers, but I just never considered it.
Well, and I love just that perspective, right? Because the other perspective that you see a lot of is, people in senior leadership roles thinking that all of that is beyond them. It's like, well, that's for everyone else, but for me. So the fact that you saw that, I would admire and applaud those individuals to kind of say, yeah, there are reasons why I need to go through it that are personal, but also important for the business. So that, I think, is really healthy when someone can kind of say that. I even worked with a chief of staff physician who decided that he was kind of going to go back to practice, do surgeries and practice his skills as a physician that he has long been away from as an administrator, because he wanted to set the tone to everybody, all the physicians in this large group of hospitals, that the learning never stops and that you need to be prepared to go back to the basics. And that's, very few, very senior accomplished leaders, have the humility to do something like that. So I get charged by leaders like that who want to set that kind of tone.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And Doug Conant, who was on the show, talks about really, one of his principles being learn or die.
Yeah,
I mean, it has to be something that is ongoing every day. So therefore, and you talk about this in your book, the resiliency component. So when you're forced into a situation like we are, as far as forced transformation, you're going to be more resilient if you have that foundational backup, for sure.
Yeah. And then on that, I just released an ebook this week on adversity, and what I've also talked about, resilience is important, right? And it's defined as that ability to bounce back. So we understand that. That's commonly understood. But I've always felt, certainly as I lived through my own leadership roles and the adversity that I faced, I quickly realized resilience isn't enough. You keep bouncing back over and over again. And I use the analogy of, I don't know if you had this as a kid, that kind of Bozo the Clown punching bag toy that, you kind of hit it and just keep coming back up. And over a period of time, that can wear on you. And what we need in addition to it is a real deep sense of resolve. And I think that's what we're going to need to draw on over the next little while as we're coping with the world that we're in right now, is that just that sheer determination to bring people together, to lead them through this and come out the other end, hopefully in a better place. Hard to see that now, given a lot of the tragedy that people are experiencing, but ultimately that's what we have to do as leaders.
Yeah, and we will persevere. I mean, it will happen. Mm-hmm. And so in the book, you really focus in on the first part of the book, on that whole individual element and component. You talked about that being one of the areas to focus in on. And then you start getting into, okay, well, I let's just assume that I have the skills and the characteristics and all of that. And so then how do we create community? And so you talk about, which I think we can all resonate with, 5 characteristics of mediocre leaders. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that because we know those. Or in other words, they blame others. They're selfish and self-serving, unskilled and mean, inept and incompetent, and they lack initiative. But I really want to focus more on the 5 behaviors of truly, and again, there's that word I still have to get over it, Vince, accountable leaders. So run us through those 5.
Well, the first is, it begins with holding yourself and other ones to high standards of performance, right? Now, one might say, well, that's obvious. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is obvious, but it's not in practice. And I've got the research in the book that demonstrates that. That's the foundation, right? A lot of people now are talking about, well, how do you lead in a virtual world when you don't see your workers? And I always like asking, well, what's really changed? You've got to drive results, yeah. You've got a plan you've got to drive, yeah. Okay, you may not see them every day, but they still got to drive those results. So what are your standards? Now, have they changed? Have to be morphed because of the conditions? But nothing's changed. It's always about it's always about the high standards that we need to set the bar high for ourselves and for our teams. That's what we learned where it starts. And this is all based on research that we've done, globally. The second, and it ties directly to the research as well, and my work with the leadership contract, is having the courage, to have tough conversations and make difficult decisions. And we see this over and over again. When leaders wimp out, this is where they become mediocre. We have a lot of people in leadership roles that avoid the hard work. And a lot of the hard work is always around people, right? They're not giving candid feedback. They're not managing poor performers aggressively enough. And now the complexity is, how do you do that when people are working remotely and you don't have as much line of sight to them? That's the new challenge for leaders. The third is, and this is tied to the standards, but it's about bringing clarity to people, is their ability to communicate the strategy to everyone. But it's not just kind of, reading a bunch of slides and saying, here are our pillars, here's our strategic pillars, and here's our objectives. It's really helping translate what the strategic imperatives are for the team and for every individual, so I know how I fit in contributing to the overall success of the company, right? That becomes important. The next one is really interesting and really needed now, is that they express optimism about the future and the company. So that means that you are personally excited to be in the company, right? That kind of excitement oozes out of your pores in a very genuine and authentic way. It's not, phony rah type of speeches. Is that this is the place. And I think it's really important that you've got to ask yourself, if you're not excited, if you look to the future and you're not optimistic, you got to really question whether you need to be in that leadership role at that moment in time, because you're not doing yourself or your teams any favor around that. And the fifth one is really tied back to our earlier conversation around the context, is that they certainly have, their heads down executing on priorities, but they balance that with kind of looking externally to see what's coming so they can anticipate things and they can pivot when they need to. So those tend to be the 5 behaviors of truly accountable leaders that kind of really set themselves apart from the rest. And in the book, I share research that really shows that these leaders really exist in industry-leading performing companies. And you can just see how different they are from the mediocre leaders in poor or even average performing companies.
So as you're talking about that, and I think about these statistics, and I'm looking, at those organizations that are not in that top tier, because nobody wants to self-admit that, I'm just one of the mediocre ones, right? I mean, nobody's going to do that.
Yeah.
So, what is going to have to happen in order for that realization to occur and changes start to happen so therefore I can get to the top tier?
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely right. We don't want to admit it publicly, but, I think my sense is most people know if they're in a leadership role and they're struggling and they're mediocre, they kind of know it. I can tell you 100% with 100% insurance, everyone else around you knows it, right? And so there are no surprises. But you have to understand, it's not necessarily about them. So this is where the organizational piece comes in, because what I find is a lot of times when you confront it in sessions with leaders and they sort of admit it, have the courage to admit it, they're not making excuses, but they're kind of saying, well, the organization hasn't really made it clear what it means to be a leader. And so they have to set clear expectations. And I talk about how you do that through a leadership contract for the company that says, here are the 4 or 5 or 6 things we expect of our leaders. And I've seen a shift just by doing that, because now leaders say, oh, I get it now. Okay, I can work towards that. But without it, some leaders can kind of pick it up, but a lot of leaders don't. So that's why I think a dual response is necessary. Then you have to find, do you really want this role? I share a story in a book where one person based out of just outside of Chicago attended a speech I did, really liked the ideas. And then I met up with him about a year later by accident when I was back in Chicago. And he'd said, I took those ideas and I went to our CEO because he had a CFO who was his best friend and had worked in the company for a long time. He was loyal to him, but he was absolutely mediocre in his role. And he didn't want to address it at all. And this guy I talked to kept pushing the CEO. Finally, they had a conversation with the CFO, and he said, it's the finances that drive my passion. I don't want to manage at all people. And because of his loyalty to the CEO, he took the job, but he had no passion for the people side of it. So they rejigged his role and made him a pure financial guru. And that gave him, not that he didn't like people, he wanted to mentor the whole finance and accounting team, which they shifted his role, brought in kind of a real CFO that managed the team and the other things. And it was a win-win, right? So it doesn't mean that it always has negative outcomes. We just have to have the courage to confront it when it surfaces. I think we need to have the self-courage to identify when we're slipping, right? Seth Godin has a great line about mediocrity. He says it's a slippery slope, right? If you just start even allowing a little bit to seep into how you lead, you'll wake up one day and be completely mediocre, not even know it. And that's the problem.
Well, and I also think too that when you start thinking about the younger generation and this whole sensitivity issue, I think some people think that you can do this, in a purely blissful and encouraging manner. I mean, in order for change to happen, friction is required. I mean, it's required. So, and we see it now. I mean, this is forced friction. So, man, it's either change or go extinct. I mean, it's.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just what it is.
Yeah, and it's a great point, because I think what people misunderstand sometimes is the notion of if you're having a tough conversation with someone, right? People are a little bit uneasy. Steve Jobs, whatever you want to say about him, his brilliance coupled with his harsh leadership style. Someone once asked him, "So why are you so hard on people?" And he goes, "Well, if I'm not, then I'm actually being selfish. I'm kind of protecting myself, and I'm not doing them any favors." But if you think about kind of being really tough with an individual, if I think about the people in my life who had the courage to come to me, to sit me down and say, "Vince, we got to have a talk." In that moment, we hate that experience as humans. We've all had that. But when I think about it, it's like, wow, they cared for me enough, right, to say, I have to sit down with you because I care about your success. And you're on a path here that I don't think will make you successful. Right? And yet, because it's so much easier to say, oh, I don't give a crap about that person, and not say anything. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen it over and over again where a leader just by surprise gets fired and then starts hearing about the reasons that nobody had the courage to come, to have full disclosure. And they realize, why didn't anybody tell me? Right? I could have tried to work on something. Right? To me, that's a real shame to do that. So I think we've got to shift our mindset around those standards and not have the fear, and realize that real toughness comes from a place of caring about someone, caring about their well-being, caring about their success, because we all have blind spots. We don't see it all, right? So that's kind of my perspective on it, I think a lot of us need to reframe and not be so hesitant or afraid about these conversations we need to have.
And as you were even talking about that organizational, expectation setting and visioning, to me, that has to be in there.
You're absolutely right.
Okay, so when I start thinking about all of these factors and all of, let's think about the outcome elements. I, of course, just because of what I do and where I am and how I feel, I start thinking about the employee and the customer experience. We talked about that translative property, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what does all this really mean for the customer?
Well, I think it's sort of, there's this research that I think Sears did years back, that they were able to kind of track, the impact of engagement, employee engagement on the customer experience, right, and customer loyalty. And at the time afterwards, I think some of that research was criticized for being a bit faulty. But regardless of that, there are sometimes just ideas that just make sense, right? And that to me is one of them, right? Is that if you look at, and I share some of the research, I didn't do it, a large firm did, that looked at the connection between the leadership experience and the employee experience. So if employees see their top level of leaders working well together, their personal sense of engagement automatically goes to 72%. Though if they see their top leaders not working well together, lots of conflict, lots of dysfunction, their engagement drops down to 8%. Right? So companies have been struggling trying to fix employee engagement for years. So you don't need to bring in foosball tables and enhance, it doesn't matter now anyways, because it doesn't look like we're going to have offices anymore. So you don't need to worry about that. So now the engagement challenges become even more pronounced. But the leadership experience drives the employee experience, which in turn drives the customer experience. And we all feel that as customers, right? You go into a store, you order something online, you can tell what kind of state that employee is in. And I bet you, if you ask, so how are you being managed? They'll tell you. But when you're getting exceptional service, exceptional performance, I can tell you behind that are a great group of accountable leaders that are creating the conditions for that to happen. So that to me is that. The other benefit, of course, is, you talked about the generations. If you think about what has been the impact, what I have learned is, I'm kind of the early lead Gen X, tail end boomer. I don't connect to both in some ways because I'm at that early stage. But, boomers put up with the worst leaders. They wore it as a badge of honor. Gen X aspired for more, but couldn't quite figure out. Millennials came in expecting to work for great leaders, and if they didn't get them, they left. Right? They just walked out. Gen Z's coming in, I think they're going to be the most interesting generation because they've had the most leadership development of any other generation coming in, because leadership has become so prevalent as a topic in the last 5 to 10 years. So I look at my own kids who have had more formal leadership development. The concept of leadership has been ingrained in their head already. I think they're just going to come in and just naturally lead because that's what they've done. And their ability to work together is actually quite interesting. So we'll see how it all plays out. But that's the generational slant on all that. But at the bottom line, it's great leadership experiences translate to great employee experiences, which translate to a best customer experience. And that's a winning formula for any company.
Well, most definitely. And when I think about all of this, there's just so many factors, and it's the circumstances, the risk levels. It's just totally heightened. But so you need a whole lot of inspiration behind you in order to really tackle, the issues that we have today and really move things forward. And one of the things that we look at on the show to help us with that are quotes. Is there a quote or two that you like that you can share?
Yeah, well, I think I'll probably do 3 right now, if that's okay. So the first one we talked about is that one around, the new game begins before the old one ends. And to your earlier point, we have been thrust into the new game right now, right? All of the things that have been happening pre-COVID. Now it's just boom, we've kind of accelerated it, and now we need to respond. I love a quote, the 7 Habits book from Stephen Covey has a ton of them, but, he had this one quote that always stays with me because it's about my accountability in any situation. And he says, how you see the problem is the problem. And I love that line if you kind of think about it. And then the final quote is I think sort of an old Yiddish term that says, sort of be gentle with the people you deal with every day, because everyone has a burden that they're carrying that you don't know about. And I think in today's world particularly, we need to find this balance of driving performance because we have to, but also bring a bit of compassion because people are dealing with a lot, whether it's homeschooling or caring for elderly parents, trying to drive performance, figuring out this whole virtual world. And so we need to know that's kind of the context we're in right now.
Most definitely. Now, to get there, you and I have kind of talked about this off mic. We all have, issues that we've had to address, learnings that we had, and we talk about getting over the hump. Is there a time where you had to get over the hump that you can share with us?
Well, the two very quickly. The first one was very early in my career. I worked in a large public sector organization, and you referenced it in my bio, where a woman named Zinta, who wasn't even my manager, she was 2 levels removed from my direct manager, but saw something in me, gave me an opportunity. We had an organization that did really, really important work. We helped some of the neediest people in our society get their lives back on track through financial assistance or retraining programs or going back to school. So the meaning and the purpose of the organization was compelling. And someone coming just out of my undergraduate program, I was excited to have a role like that. But then I was struck by just the feel of the place. I remember entering the office the first time. All I saw was this sea of beige, old desks, really tattered walls, and the people kind of resembled the environment. Nice people, but they showed up every day as zombies, just kind of going through the motions, committed, to their customer or to their clients that they served, but there wasn't a lot of energy. And she approached me one day saying, I think you want to have an impact on this place beyond your job. And I said to her, yeah, I do, Zinta. I see opportunity. And I didn't even know how she knew that about me because I never shared that publicly with anyone. So we set up this small committee, we put some things in place, and we started to see changes happening. This dull, environment of apathy started to have more vibrancy, more, it was fun. And I started to realize, wow, one manager can have an impact. Well, a few months later, unfortunately, Zinta was diagnosed with lung cancer, had to leave immediately to start her treatments. And all of a sudden, everything ground to a halt. The changes we put in place didn't sustain themselves. A few months went by. I heard she wasn't doing well. I went to visit her. And in that visit, she shared with me her experience as a senior manager and kind of pulled back the curtain on a culture that I was unaware of as a frontline employee. This toxic management culture, the infighting, the bickering, the gamesmanship, the politics. And she said, I've always taken care of my health. I've never smoked a cigarette in my life. I have no history of lung cancer in my family. I am convinced that this disease that I'm fighting is a result of spending my career in this environment. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. 2 weeks after, she actually sent me a letter. That was a time when people still used to write letters. And in that letter, she challenged me. She said, what are you going to do, Vince, with your life? Are you going to be are you going to be a consequence and a victim of this environment? Or are you going to do something different? And 2 weeks after I got that letter, she passed away. And that letter was a trigger for me to think, what's my life really going to be about? And I began to see a world that most of us weren't even aware of as employees. And I decided to leave, and that's kind of been my mission ever since, I had the glimpse early in my career of what it was like to work with a great leader. I felt what it did to me, how I wanted to really, work hard to make her feel proud of me. And then that was gone. And so and that's on a personal level, why I try to strive to do that myself. Not easy to do, but that's kind of, the game plan as a leader. So the next big crisis, fundamental, there were other ones, of course, but was the last global financial crisis. And at that moment in time, there I think was a reframing, as soon as we started to realize what was going to happen. And I had a really, really great team. And I remember in one meeting, I said, now we'll see how good we really are. Because we were pretty successful. We were building a dominant brand, in our space, doing some great work with our customers. But now in the face of adversity, that was the test. And we were fortunate to meet that test. But I think right now that's the opportunity. We can kind of get overwhelmed by everything that's coming at us. But I think we look to our leaders to give us a way forward, to maybe reframe the current challenge in a more inspirational way. And I think that's, the opportunity that we have. How do we reframe the current situation? Not denying the tragedy that's around us, because that is hard stuff. But at the end, leaders have to lead. And that's where we have to find a way to lead our people through inspiration, through optimism, through bringing them together and putting that challenge out there. How good are we really? This is the test.
Well, I am so sorry that she experienced that fate, but so blessed that it was a trigger for you. And the Fast Leader Legion wishes you the very best. Now, before we move on, let's get a quick word from our sponsor. An Even Better Place to Work is an easy-to-use solution that gives you a continuous diagnostic on employee engagement along with integrated activities that will improve employee engagement and leadership skills in everyone. Using this award-winning solution is guaranteed to create motivated, productive, and loyal employees who have great work relationships with their colleagues and your customers. To learn more about An Even Better Place to Work, visit beyondmorale.com/better. All right, here we go, Fast Leader Legion. It's time for the Hump Day Hoedown. Okay, Vince, the Hump Day Hoedown is a part of our show where you give us good insights fast. So I'm going to ask you several questions, and your job is to give us robust yet rapid responses that are going to help us move onward and upward faster. Vince Molinaro, are you ready to hoe down?
I am ready, Jim. Let's go.
All right. So what is holding you back from being an even better leader today?
Yeah, right now it's the place where my business is now, where I have to kind of build a lot of our solutions and do them as quickly as possible. What's holding me back? It could be a part of me that tries to overcomplicate things. So I have to really remind myself, keep it simple, keep the momentum going, and get it done. And when I find myself kind of embroiled in complexity, stop it.
What is the best leadership advice you have ever received?
The best leadership advice, I would say it's really around to have the courage to go after the issues that other leaders are afraid of going after. Because if you do, you just create a team that's open to confronting those issues, as difficult as they may be, but having that courage and that resolve to go after things.
And what is one of your secrets that you believe contributes to your success?
Well, for me personally, it's that conviction to strive to, given the work that I do, there could be a tendency to preach and not practice. And for me, I think, as I talk to my team, is our special sauce is to practice what we preach, because our clients will feel it, will have more integrity in their presence. And that to me is a special element that differentiates us.
And what is one of your tools that you believe contributes to your success?
Well, I think it's a humility around leadership is a tough role that you never get there. You can't be arrogant about it in spite of any success you've had in the past. So it's really, for me, it's the embracing the ideas of the leadership contract, making my decision, being clear on my obligation, tackling the hard work, and building the community. That's what I write about, but that's what I do personally as well.
And what would be one book you'd recommend to our Legion? It could be from any genre. Of course, we're going to put a link to accountable leaders on your show notes page as well.
I've been rereading Viktor Frankl's book in Search of Meaning.
Okay, Fast Leader Legion, you can find links to that and other bonus information from today's show by going to fastleader.net/Vince Molinaro. Okay, Vince, this is my last Hump Day Hoedown question. Imagine you were given the opportunity to go back to the age of 25. And you can take the knowledge and skills that you have now back with you, but you can't take it all. You can only take one. So what skill or piece of knowledge would you take back with you, and why?
I would say that to speak the truth as you see it, and not hold back far more than I probably did. And I'm a pretty direct person, but I look back and go, I could have been even more direct and not be afraid of any repercussions. And I think there's a lot of employees that hold back, and they hold back insights and information that leaders need to drive success, and we need to unleash that.
Vince, I had fun with you today. Can you please share with the Fast Leader Legion how they can connect with you?
On LinkedIn, that's where I can be found. Happy to connect with your fans on that, and certainly on Twitter. But LinkedIn is the primary source for folks.
Vince Molinaro, thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. The Fast Leader Legion honors you, and thanks you for helping us get over the hump. Thank you for joining me on the Fast Leader Show today. For recaps, links from every show, special offers, and access to download and subscribe, if you haven't already, head on over to fastleader.net so we can help you move onward and upward faster.